Welcome, welcome, friends. Today is May 30th. We are at Plato's Pod. This is a live discussion being recorded. We meet through Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, and Online Rebels. We will be being part of a live discussion run by James Myers. Good morning, James, from this beautiful Toronto Sunday.
Good morning, Eva. It is indeed a beautiful sunny day today, and very excited to talk about today's dialogue. It's a dialogue that I've read now, I think, 3 times, and every time I pick it up, including about 2 hours ago this morning, I discover new things in it. And so it's very excited to talk about this because this dialogue is about knowledge. It's about wisdom. And the part that we're covering today, which is about the first 24 pages or so, actually ends up at the subject of memory. And so the question is, how do we remember the knowledge that we take in from time to time? And I found that was a really interesting connection this morning that I hadn't thought about before. So very interested in probing this idea of memory today and how that fits in with our knowledge. So when you see something, or you hear something, or taste, or smell something, or touch something, that forms maybe part of our knowledge. But memory, I think, is what also forms part of the knowledge. And that's the conclusion that I think we're ending up with today in the section at 163E to 164B. So we'll end with that. And I picked 3 different themes that we could explore, that being one of them. But we can go anywhere we want in this discussion today. It really is up to those joining us. And so I just wanted to extend a very warm welcome to those who are new joining the group. Welcome, and please do feel free to add your voice to the discussion at any point that you want. We will proceed as we have before. We'll use the raise hands feature in Zoom if you'd like to speak. And I'll take the speakers in order. I'll give preference to those who haven't spoken before. And so please feel free to add your voice to that. And then after the recording is ended today, after around 2 hours, we'll end the recording. Those who wish are welcome to stay with us, and we'll just have a very informal discussion in Plato's Cafe, which is what we call our informal discussion after the recorded meetup ends. And we'll do that for about a half an hour and just, share ideas on either this dialogue or any of Plato's dialogues, or even just philosophy in general. So we had an interesting discussion 2 weeks ago in Plato's Cafe, and interested in seeing where it goes today. So again, a warm welcome to everybody. I just wanted to start with a video that I encountered a few days ago. It's an interview of the famous giant physicist, Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman died in, I think it was 1988, but he was and is still held to be one of the giants of physics of all time. And I think it's partially for his clarity of explanation. The so-called Feynman lectures, which he gave to students, have been written. Some of them have been recorded. And I think that that's maybe the mark of a good scientist, is somebody who can explain the knowledge that they have in a way that really connects with people. And so I found this video of Richard Feynman talking to I think it's a BBC reporter, very interesting because he actually talks about memory. So this video is shot in, I think it's in Yorkshire, somewhere in England. And I think, as the interviewer explains before the part of the clip that we'll show, it's at the home of his wife's family, I think. And so this is recorded in the 1970s. The sound is a little bit scratchy, and it's the interview is filmed with a small waterfall in the background. So it kind of muffles the sound a little bit. But I think the idea is very clear that he's expressing. What really struck me was the look of almost joy on his face as he's talking about knowledge. So he really touches on a number of things that we'll talk about, or we could talk about, in today's discussion on the Theaetetus. But he also touches on some topics that we touched on in our discussion on Phaedrus. And so I thought it was a really interesting way to bring some of the ideas together as we head to wind up season 1 of Plato's Pod. So we'll discuss the first part of Theaetetus today, and then the second part we'll cover in 2 weeks. I don't think we'll make it through the entire dialogue. Hopefully we'll get up to the point where the dialogue starts to take on the idea of motion. So we'll deal with the themes of knowledge and memory in Theaetetus before motion is brought into the picture. So without further ado, Eva, if you could start the video. This is sort of starting in the middle of the interview. And we'll just watch for, it's a little bit less than 4 minutes, I think, and maybe pick up on some of the themes that Richard Feynman is talking about here.
Conventional wisdom. One Sunday, all the kids were all walking in little parties with their fathers in the woods. Then the next Monday, we were playing in a field, and the kid said to me, "Say, what's that bird? What's the name of it? Do you know the name of that bird?" I says, "I haven't the slightest idea." He said, "Well, it's a brown-throated thrush." He says, "Your father doesn't teach you anything." But my father had already taught me about the names of birds. We walked and he says, "That's a brown-throated thrush." He says, "Know what the name of that bird is? A brown-throated thrush. In German, it's called a Fliegenflügel. In Chinese, it's called a Qinglongtong. In Japanese, a Tahatahara, and so on. And when you know all the names in every language of that bird, you know nothing, but absolutely nothing about the bird. And then we would go on and talk about the pecking and the feathers. So I had learned already that names don't constitute knowledge, but to knowing the name of something. That's caused me a certain trouble since, because I refuse to learn the name of anything. So when someone comes in and says, "You got any explanation for the Fitz-Cronin experiment?" I says, what's that? He says, "You know, that the long-lived K meson disintegrates into 2 pies. Oh, yes, now I know. But I never know the names of things. What he forgot to tell me was that knowing the names of things is useful if you want to talk to somebody else. So you tell him what you're talking about.
But the basic principle of knowing about something rather than just knowing its name is something that you stuck to, is it?
Yes, of course. You have to learn. These are kind of disciplines in the field of science that you have to learn. That to know when you know and when you don't know, and what it is you know and what it is you don't know. And it's you got to be very careful not to confuse yourself.
How else did you try and
progress?
mold your methods of thinking, the way you looked at the world?
Well, we had a lot of little games, like he would say at the dinner table. He'd think of some little problem, and he'd say, "Suppose you were a Martian, we were Martians, and we came down to this Earth, and we'd look at it from the outside." And that, I can't explain exactly what he meant, but there's a way of looking something anew, as if you never saw it before, for the first time, and asking questions about it as if you were different. For instance, if you would ask, later I did some little amusing research for a paper in college on sleep, but it started with a question of his kind. Suppose you were a Martian who never slept. They didn't have sleep. You didn't have to sleep. And you came down to this Earth and you saw these people had this funny property that every day for a certain amount of time had to lie down and become unconscious. And then the natural question would be, how does it feel to get unconscious? What happens to you? Ideas run along and suddenly they stop, or do they just run more and more slowly? But what happens to your ideas? How does it feel to become unconscious? So I tried to answer the question. What happens when you become unconscious?
But you find that these days, you still, when you're faced with a particularly difficult problem, when you're absolutely stuck, you tend to say, let's look at it like a Martian would look at it. And
sometimes. There are lots of things that people did. For example, Maxwell put the equations together. Faraday formulated the equations mathematically with some model in his head. And then Dirac got his answer by just writing and guessing an equation. And other people got their answer, like in relativity, got the idea by looking at principles of symmetry. Now, all these methods, and Heisenberg got his quantum mechanics by thinking only talk about the things that you can measure. Now, all of these ideas, we should only talk about things that we can measure. Try to define things in terms of only things you can measure. Or let's formulate the equation mathematically. Or let's guess the equation. Or all these things are tried all the time. Look for symmetries. All that stuff is tried. All that stuff, when we're going against the problem, we do all that. That's very useful. But we all know that. That's what we learn in the physics classes, how to do that. But the new problem, where we're stuck because all those methods don't work. If any of those methods would have worked, we would have gone through there. So when we get stuck in a certain place, it's a place where history will not repeat herself. And that's makes it even more exciting, because whatever we're going to look at the method and the trick and the way it's going to look is going to be very different than anything that we've seen before, because we've used all the methods from before. So, therefore, a thing like the history of the idea is an accident of how things actually happen. And if I want to turn the history around to try to get a new way of looking at it, it doesn't make any difference. I don't care. The only thing that the real test in physics is experiment, and history is fundamentally irrelevant.
The most enduring legacy from his father was not just learning to question the physical world, but an enthusiasm for the inquiry, which at 54 Feynman still shares today.
It has to do with curiosity. It has to do with people wondering what makes something do something.
Thank you for sharing that, Eva. I just so that was for those who joined partway through that. That was the great physicist Richard Feynman being interviewed in the 1970s. I think it was in the UK where he was visiting, and he really, I think, just touched on so many of the ideas that Plato is covering here in Theaetetus, the first part that we're talking about today. And you know, he actually starts with a memory of what he learned from his father. So his father was, I think, a tailor in New York City. And he learned certain things from his father. His father wasn't a physicist, but what he learned from his father kind of enabled him to proceed in physics and to be curious. And I really like that recollection of his sitting around the dinner table and pretending that they're all Martians coming down to Earth and looking at the people on Earth and wondering, you know, what it is to sleep, you know, to have knowledge of what it is like to sleep and to be unconscious. I mean, it's a very interesting question. And so he says he wrote a paper about that for university. So he touched upon a number of things, including the idea of defining what a bird is, you know, the brown-throated thrush, and he gave the name in 3 different languages. And that really kind of reminded me of Phaedrus at around 277 C, where Socrates says, first you must know the truth concerning everything you are speaking or writing about. You must learn how to define each thing in itself. And having defined it, you must know how to divide it into kinds until you reach something indivisible. And, you know, here Richard Feynman is talking about, well, you might know the name of the bird, but until you define what the actual bird is, you don't really have knowledge of the bird. So that really struck me as a very powerful video. And so I'm hoping that maybe we can kind of, as we discuss today, we can kind of pick up on some of the themes that Feynman brought to us in that recording. You know, the idea of looking at something anew is something that he talked about in that recording as well. And, you know, again, that was kind of the Martian analogy. If you were a Martian, how would you look at things? I was listening to a podcast yesterday. It's the Joy of X podcast by mathematician Steve Strogatz, and it's sponsored by Quantum Magazine, which is a brilliant magazine. Explains some very difficult concepts in mathematics and physics, I think in a way that's very relatable. And Strogatz was interviewing physicist Robert Digraph. And Robert Digraph's path to physics was fascinating to listen to because he started in physics and it didn't quite click with him. And then he tells Strogatz in this interview that he went to art school for 2 years. So he stopped doing physics and he went to art school. And then he says that you know, that understanding of the meaning of art and the process of doing art rekindled in him a passion for physics. And that has actually some relation to what Feynman said in this you know, recording, in this interview. You know, knowledge in us is triggered in different ways. And in Digraph's case, in that podcast that I was listening to, it was triggered by art. You know, but Feynman talked about how, you know, Heisenberg liked the idea of, you know, only talking about things that you can measure. Other people, he said, you know, hit upon knowledge just, you know, by a random process. So each of us has a different approach to knowledge. And I thought that was kind of a powerful thing that Feynman said. But the interesting thing is that whole interview of Feynman was brought about by a memory of his father. And so the Theaetetus starts with a memory. And the section that we'll end with reading today is all about memory. So the Theaetetus starts with 2 characters who are not then part of the subsequent dialogue, and they're recalling what Socrates told, and they're putting it not just in the context of the exact replay of the words that Socrates said, but they're actually doing a reconstruction of the scene that Socrates relates this whole discussion that he had with Theodorus, the geometer, and Theaetetus, the mathematician. So it's a dramatic reconstruction of something that Socrates had related, and so that's another interesting connection, I think, to Phaedrus. This whole idea of memory in that famous sequence in Phaedrus that we covered between Thamus and Thuth. Thamus, the Egyptian king, and Thuth, the god of writing, and the idea of how one recalls knowledge. And if one recalls it just in writing, the point that they were making in Phaedrus is that we can kind of forget the source of the knowledge, and we can rely on the written word too much without really going back to the source, which in Phaedrus says the source is actually inside the soul. So that's by way of introduction. And I'm just wondering, just as we kind of maybe talk about the idea of memory today, what is it about memory that kind of ties knowledge together? And I'm just wondering, maybe from individual experience, in what we've read in the first part of Theaetetus that we'll discuss today, is there any particular things about memory that you think are important, to keep in mind, and what are the key elements of memory, and how does memory go wrong sometime, and is memory different for each of us? These are themes that I'm thinking that maybe we can build on today in our discussion. So I think one of the things, about memory is that it is different for each of us. And I'm just wondering, we'll take Moshe and then JK, and maybe just if you can, maybe if there's any personal kind of perspective on memory that you can offer, that would be great, or just anything in general. Moshe, your thoughts?
Well, I was wondering why you're introducing this through memory, because this dialogue is a dialogue that was written down by Euclid, and he says that he had heard the dialogue, and as soon as he got home, I filled up from memory, writing them down at leisure. Whenever I went to Athens, I asked Socrates about the point that I had forgotten or may return and then I returned and made corrections. So this isn't purely from memory. He's writing down, these are contemporaneous notes that he's correcting with the author himself. So I'm wondering what your tie-in is here to memory, because when the servant starts to read what the dialogue was, it immediately starts to talk about knowledge, and Theaetetus' idea at first that it's perception.
Thank you for the question. There's a passage right near the beginning at 143c, and so this is where Euclides is relating the story to Terpsion, and Euclides says, "I wanted, in the written version, to avoid the bother of having the bits of narrative in between the speeches. I mean, when Socrates, whenever he mentions his own part in the discussion, says, 'and I maintained,' or 'I said,' or of the person answering, 'he agreed,' or 'he would not admit this.' That is why I made him talk directly to them, and I have left out these formulae." So it's kind of not a direct transcript of what Socrates told him. It's a reconstruction, and that's why I thought that was kind of interesting. It's not a direct transcript, and even when you make a direct transcript, you can't get the inflections of the speaker. You get the meaning of the speaker in a direct transcript. You get the context of it in a direct transcript. So, I mean, I think, and certainly when we end up today at 163, 164, it touches directly on memory. So thank you for the question. And that's why I thought that this was a kind of interesting introduction to tie the themes together, starting with, man is the measure of all things, which we'll discuss, I think, shortly, and then ending it with the idea of memory. JK, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking about memory always involves a certain, involves certain interpretations based on one's emotional or intellectual, uh, you know, um, tendency or bias. So it's always selective memory. You never get exactly what happened. It's just like when Feynman was talking about the names of birds. Once you give the names, you understand. You know what the names are, but it's already by understanding or focusing on the name, you're kind of ignoring what the real bird really is. Kind of narrowing it down to what is the meaning of what you take to be the meaning of the name, and you're ignoring the actual bird itself. So like in memory, you're always using language and concepts that are already divorced or alien from the actual thing itself. So it's always selective memory. As I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I think that's, none of us has a perfect memory. And, does our recounting or does our account of things, when we render an account of our memory, do we render a full account? Do we render an account of what particularly struck us in the meaning of something? Do we render an account of how we actually derived that knowledge? So if I tell you I know that a certain thing is or is not, am I also necessarily telling you how I came to that knowledge? Maybe or maybe not. Maybe sometimes I would, maybe sometimes I wouldn't. But, do you act on my memory? Does my relating my memory change you? And, if I'm relating a specific memory, how do I then get back to the general form that underlied that memory? To bring up that idea of Phaedrus, of this idea of the general form, the basis of the memory. So thank you. Donald, welcome. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think memory here goes a bit deeper in that we are talking about, in the dialogue, is taking up Heraclitus's kind of doctrine of flux. And if we are constantly becoming something other than what we are, what keeps all those others together as something continuous through time? And I think it is memory. So memory in that sense is at the heart of the dialogue. It is also, I think, true generally in Plato that it is not the particular verbal formulations, that just remembering them. In fact, I've lost all my examples, but there are cases in the dialogue where in different dialogues, characters will repeat the exact words that Socrates took as an answer or seemed acceptable. And they will repeat them to Socrates in some other dialogue, and then he will destroy that formulation because it's clear they do not see the underlying reality. That Feynman nailed it correctly. And that's a brilliant little 4 minutes on, it's not the names or the words or the language that we use. It's our ability to see the reality. And that's kind of what I think here. This is actually a very friendly dialogue. It's not adversarial between Theaetetus and Socrates like it is in others. It also reminds me of my youth. I was a young mathematician, and against the advice of my professor, I decided to study philosophy, and he told me I should do math until I was 25, and then I could spend the rest of my life doing philosophy. He was right, but I'm way older than 25 now, so I can't do math or philosophy. But memory, very, very important here. I think it's what provides continuity in this flux environment that's in this dialogue. I think that's enough.
Well, thank you, Donald. And when you talk about flux, actually, that was there's a part in the second reading that I excerpted here in the notes that are posted on the shared drive, and it's around 152E, I would say. And there's this wonderful passage, and maybe I'll just read it here, that and this is the idea of becoming, the state of becoming. It's actually on it's on that page of it. It's it's the second paragraph under Socrates here. Well, actually, the end of the first paragraph. So Socrates says, "What is really true is this: the things of which we naturally say that they are in a process of coming to be, as the result of movement and change and blending with one another. We are wrong when we say they are, since nothing ever is, but everything is coming to be." And then he goes on to say, "And as regards this point of view, let us take it as a fact that all the wise men of the past, with the exception of Parmenides, stand together. Let us take it that we find on this side Protagoras and Heraclitus and Empedocles, and also the masters of the two kinds of poetry, Epicharmus in comedy and Homer in tragedy. For when Homer talked about ocean, begetter of gods, and Theaetetus, their mother, he made all things the offspring of flux and motion. Or don't you think he meant that?" So you raised, Donald, the very interesting question of, if we ourselves are the product of flux and motion, how do we remember? So thank you for that. Thank you for that point. And I just wanted to tie it to that specific paragraph, which I think is very key. Greg, welcome. What are your thoughts?
I'm kind of in the same line as Donald just said. I think at that time, when there's very little written materials, all knowledge are stored in the individual in the form of memory. So memory is indeed regarded very important, and there's a goddess for memory at the time to cherish the faculty of memory. And that's, memory is all what we know. But I think the dialogue seemed to get into this to see that, memory certainly has a lot of things. Some are come from perception, some from just, listening to other people, some are from our reasoning, and so come to understanding. All these are precipitate in the form of memory, and later on kind of come out as knowledge if they are. So it is important, but I think in some way that it's lumped together. Socrates and these philosophers realize that is a memory thing. You can't really call knowledge is memory, but knowledge somehow is very tied into memory, because until you write out, it is in your memory. And how do you express it? And it's constantly in flux. You may remember something you think is knowledge, but as you go on, your understanding gets better. Your knowledge changes, just like things changes. So this knowledge itself changes. How do we tie it down? So I think they are just trying to explore this relationship between knowledge and memory, perception, all that, to pin down what is knowledge that what they ask, and make knowledge be independent in a sense. On one hand, to the perception and material, but on the other hand, to the memory itself. I think they want to. I've sensed there's attempt to make knowledge really be independent of memory itself. So anyway, that's my kind of sense. Oh, by the way, also I appreciate the little video about famine. Great. I think I particularly think that he said that history of idea is accidental, and this is profound. I think he pointed out that the known really in some way is the limit of knowing the unknown. And I'm being scientist, he's my hero. And I think I quote one of his motto that one of the sentences he said has become my motto, which is that he said, there's expanding frontier of ignorance. I don't know where he said, but I find this very striking. Like there's always more unknown than known. Mm-hmm. Anyway, talking about flux. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and he certainly did talk about the, knowing what you know and what you don't know. He had, I think there was 3 or 4 lines that he used in the middle of that, and making and understanding what you know and you don't know. And that I found that was very Socratic. Socrates says, that the oracle at Delphi said that he was wise because he knew one thing, which is that he knew nothing. And, so maybe as we think about memory, is there a limit to memory, and this idea that we'll explore of man being the measure of all things, is man or is mankind limited in its memory? Do we have limits to memory, or is memory unlimited? Is memory infinite? And do we remember things that we know and things that we don't know? Do I remember that I knew something yesterday and that I didn't know something yesterday? So it's an interesting idea. Moshe.
Okay, memory. Yes, fundamental to knowledge. I want to point out that even if we assume this to be correct, Plato doesn't tell us what memory is. So I find that a little bit disturbing. He simply assumes that it is. My remarks that it's fundamental to knowledge can be illustrated by simply considering what it would be like to give an account of something. If I want to give an account of an apple or a quantum particle, if I start my sentence by saying the quantum particle is, and I've identified the subject, and now I get to the predicate. If I'm at the predicate and I can't remember what the subject is, I won't even be able to complete my sentence. Experience and knowledge becomes impossible if memory is not there, because it would make it so that it would be possible for us to forget the subject of a sentence by the time we got to making the predicate of the sentence. That being said, no one is telling us in here what memory is. So to talk about things like, does memory have limits? What are the limits of it? We haven't identified what it is yet. So although that's a noble thing to do, it might be premature.
Thank you. And that's a question I think that we can certainly all address. And I don't claim to have full knowledge of it myself. I think it's something that we need to all bring into the conversation. And you've raised an important point. I mean, I think the idea that knowledge is recollection, recollection maybe being another word for memory, is an idea that Plato brought quite forcefully, I think, in the Meno, which we discussed before. And again, I'll remind at the end of the Meno, Socrates further defines knowledge as recollection. He says, recollection is the account of the reasons why. And maybe that's part of what we could think about in the context of memory, the account of the reasons why. And so I think in that video, Feynman gave an interesting account of the reasons why these great scientists such as Dirac arrived, and Heisenberg, for example, arrived at their particular pieces of knowledge. So, for example, Heisenberg was the one who established the uncertainty principle, the universal principle of uncertainty that exists in physics. The more you know of a particle's position, the less you know about its momentum, and the more you know about its momentum, the less you know about its position. And so Heisenberg arrived at that particular understanding of knowledge, as Feynman said, taking an approach that you can only know what you can measure, or you should only talk about what you can measure. So that's what Feynman said in that little clip. So that's the approach that Heisenberg took that led him to that particular piece of knowledge. Whereas, in the podcast that I mentioned where Digraph is talking, it was more art that inspired his knowledge of physics. And Digraph, by the way, is currently he's working on string theory and the idea that below the level of space and time, more fundamental to the level of space and time, is actually a matrix model, like a mathematical geometric matrix underlying the fabric of space and time. So the matrix exists first, and then there's a fabric of space and time. So, and he's a very well-respected and very well-spoken physicist. So interesting ideas as to how we actually arrive at our knowledge, and whether our knowledge is maybe triggered by some memories again being possibly the account of the reasons why. So maybe we can go to a reading in a minute or two, and if I could have some volunteers. It's the first reading that I've posted in the shared drive at 152D to 153A, which we can go to in a minute or two here. But if we could have a volunteer, somebody to be Socrates and somebody to be Theaetetus, maybe we can kind of talk about this idea of man being the measure of all things. Before I do that, though, I think I saw JK's hand up. JK, did you have a point you'd like to add?
Yeah, I was just going to ask and maybe entertain the idea that there is unconscious memory and there's conscious memory. And I think Plato might have suggested that there is this kind of unconscious memory that we carry, we carry with us, that also it plays a role. And that, of course, some people have photographic memories and so forth, and they can remember particulars, but how, whether that memory, how long that lasts, or it degrades over time because of this change in flux. I think it still operates there, but that there is that I think maybe it was what was Plato proposing was this this unconscious memory that is there, maybe a kind of a collective memory, a collective unconscious memory, in these different forms, archetypes or whatever. So I think that kind of plays a role there.
Thank you. And yes, the use of the word archetypes, and I think that's actually something that you mentioned in our last episode as well, that really struck me, this idea of archetype. We're maybe built on some form of memory, or some general form that then expresses itself in particulars, again, to pick up on that idea of the general form from Phaedrus. And then each of us has maybe our particular way of expressing that memory. But I think you also mentioned the important point of memory not just being individual, but memory also being collective. And so maybe each of us adds to our knowledge and to the memory of that knowledge. It's an important point, I think, that you raise, and thank you for that. And we'll just go to Nari. Nari, thank you, and welcome. And what are your thoughts?
No, I just wanted to add a bit to what JK was saying about memory, and it's just just a comment, really. Children that are 3 years old that have now become adults, or maybe around that age group, they claim to have such memory, and almost vivid memory. I've heard a personal account of a friend that said things happened to her at that age, and she was, she was certain, and she was observing a parent, and kept reinforcing this idea. And I was quite taken back with what was said, because I can't even remember myself at 3, my memory. So it's very interesting. Or some of us have a photographic memory at that age. Are some of us more aware, equipped with our memory than others. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think somebody earlier on mentioned the idea of memory perhaps sometimes being selective, and maybe our use of knowledge is also selective. Maybe we select particular pieces of knowledge that we think are important and discard others that we think are not important. And so maybe each of us kind of puts our own color on knowledge. So it's an interesting idea. So thank you for that. Joel, what are your thoughts?
This may be a little trite or trivial in the context of this discussion, but J.K. and Nari's comments about childhood memories and so on just brought it to mind. So I was visiting with a family in, of all places, New Mexico, and it was a holiday season. And the lady of the household was making sweets, fudge in particular. And I was out and I came in and I walked into the kitchen and smelled the aroma of the fudge. And I was immediately transported back to the age of 3 or 4, where I recognized that specific smell, which I had not smelt in at least 40 years, nor thought about. And bingo, I was absolutely shocked. Where did that come from? My unconscious memory. I began to inquire as to what the recipe was, because the only place that smell came from for me was my grandmother, who had long passed, who used to make a recipe of fudge. And as a child, I would anxiously wait for it to come out of the oven or the stove or however she made it. And I hadn't thought about it since I was perhaps 4 or 5 years old. And then here I was 50 years later, instantaneously and involuntarily transported back to that experience. So, is that an unconscious memory? And it's not a memory even involving necessarily words. I could think about it in words, but it was a totally different sense experience.
I love that example, Joel, because you just, case in point, you just triggered a memory in me, because my great aunt, who used to make fudge, and she used to mail it to my brother and me. And this used to be the greatest treat that we would receive. And so I had forgotten about that, Joel, until you just mentioned that. So you took me on a little time travel trip, I think, with that memory. So I appreciate that.
Wait till you walk into a room and watch it being made with the exact same scent again.
I am drooling as I imagine this. So thank you for that. And no, I think that's a very important point, actually. And so actually, Eva, I think you have a point, and then we'll go to Donald. Eva?
Yeah, just the right point, I guess. I would like to remark that we all have different memories. The only non-filtered memory is the smell. So the reason that smell really bumped into your brain directly is there's no filter. So that moment your brain remembers. Sometimes we remembers with others, our other senses add things, or they might forget. But somehow the formula of that smell is directly recognized, as if you were maybe storing that memory when you were 3 years old. So that is just like a super strong moment. And each memory, each brain functions different depending on the core memory. When it's the core memory, it means like it's really stored in the back of the brain somewhere. So any core memory can come up when it's called right. As like once I think we're going a little bit of a personal experiences here. As like a personal experience, I started speaking when I was 4 years old. So I remember the first moment that my brain was struggling to say my first word. I remember what was happening. I remember that debate. Should we try? yeah, should we try or not? So, okay, let's try. Let's try saying elvezi, which was my first word. So I remember that moment of debating in the brain. I think that's too much about the core memory or what was happening in my life at that moment of the brain. So memory is amazing in different ways. Thank you.
Interesting that you said that smell is the only unfiltered memory. That's a very interesting idea. I'm just thinking about that, we have 5 senses, right? And I think each of these senses brings us a different form of knowledge and a different form of memory, maybe. And this relates very much to the first reading that we'll do in Joel S. Maybe if I could voluntold you to help with this reading, that would be great if you wouldn't mind. But I think that's this idea that the knowledge that each of the senses brings is different, maybe, and I think you just made that point quite powerfully, Eva, with that wonderful example that Joel gave. Donald, and then Moshe. Donald?
I still think for this dialogue that there is a more fundamental sense to memory. If we ourselves are a stream, like Heraclitus's river, into which no one can step twice, how do we know that? What provides for an organism its continuity through time that allows it to recognize that it's changing? There's sort of a biological organismic memory going on that's providing identity apart from the perceptions. Well, how would we even know? If I received a perception in one instant and then I'm something else the next instant, how would I know? I think this is more, this may be more like what's mentioned in the Meno, but I think it's still pretty solid here that something is like that. When all things are, both the perceiver and the perceived are themselves caught up in becoming, how does it know? There's something else, something we can't question, because without it, we couldn't be here having this conversation.
An excellent question, and a very interesting perspective, which I think we should all add our thoughts to that. This idea of this organism in time, persisting through time, and how does it understand the connection of its own identity through time? Really interesting perspective that you brought with that question. Moshe, your thoughts?
I guess I want to go for a couple of things. One, to refine or to put a nuance on Donald's remark about Heraclitus and the inability to step into the same river twice. If you push Heraclitus a little bit, you have to ask the question, how is it possible to step in the river once? Because by the time the stepping is done, the river's completely changed. And if that's the case, flux is so dominant and preeminent that knowledge becomes impossible. You could have experience without cognition. So that's a problem for me. The problem that Eva raises and that you seem to support, namely that smell is an unfiltered memory. Well, smell is not a memory. Smell is a sensation. Smell might trigger a memory, and it might trigger a memory in an unfiltered way, but smell is not itself a memory, because I'm smelling things right now, and there's no memory involved in that at all. And the last thing that I'll mention this time is that on Eva's account, it appears that memory has something to do with the brain. It's a materialistic theory of memory, as if, my brain is in such and such a state, and this comes out as a memory. You can see the trouble with that. You might think of a mother in labor, and the child comes out of the womb, and instead of crying, it looks across the room and says, "Give me the ball." And the doctor says, "Well, what do you mean, give me the ball?" He says, "It's the one in the closet." Well, why does he say that? Well, because his brain is in such and such a formation. So if the brain is memory, then memory is material, and we might even know if they're even ours. So I know I'm playing a bit of the stick in the mud, but to get back to Plato, when the question comes in the Phaedrus of how a soul gets chosen to be in a human body, it is because it has gotten itself closest to the forms. It has had direct knowledge, direct acquaintance, I'll say acquaintance, not knowledge, of the forms, and therefore it gets into a human body. But you can imagine a case when a soul gets into a body not as a baby, but let's say as my body right now. My body was previously inanimate, or maybe it was animate, and I was a zombie. And it would be hard to tell if I'm a zombie or not. But then all of a sudden, the soul gets into me, and now I have the soul in me, which has all this knowledge. And you could, James, bring it out by asking questions, creating recollections and things like that. So I want, at least in a Platonic sense, to steer us away from a materialist conception of memory and see if we can understand what memory is on a Platonic level, because it's so easy to confuse these things, and we run amok in our thinking. At least I do.
Mm-hmm. And definitely appreciate the challenge, Moshe, on that. I think that's it's a critical point that you raise. That actually, I think we can address that actually in the reading at 154A to 154B, which is, I think, the first reading that we'll do here. Actually, it's on the third page, Eva, and this idea that memory isn't maybe something that's physical, as you were implying, Moshe. I think that's the important thing, and I think Plato actually has something to say about that. And so I think we can explore that. So I appreciate the challenge on that. And so the question for everybody is memory a purely physical, chemical process? Is memory just stored in the physical brain, or is it stored somewhere else? A critical question. So thank you very much for that. Nuri, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I was just wondering that could we trust our memory going back to so many years? And some people have a habit of altering what they remember because it becomes like a coping mechanism. It's like they want to forgive people. And it's so the memory is altered. It's not like knowledge, like in a way where you would you have facts and you write things down. Like if you go to see your doctor, things are recorded, your physical, so everything is on paper. So if you have that kind of information in your memory, how accurate is it? So just food for thought. Thank you.
Certainly the accuracy of the memory is key. And I think that, as I mentioned, I mean, my memory certainly isn't perfect, and I would be the first to admit that. And so maybe it's this idea of comparing knowledge and comparing memories is actually pretty critical. So yeah, I mean, let's explore that. So I just wanted to maybe look at this reading at 154A to 154B, and Joel S., if you wouldn't mind being Socrates in this, that would be wonderful. I don't know if I have any volunteers to be Theaetetus, or I could be Theaetetus.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. JK. So just a little setup for this is to just explain here at 152D to 153A, which is the first reading that's posted. I read a paragraph out of that a little earlier. This is after Theaetetus has concluded. Theaetetus concluded at 151E that knowledge is simply perception. So that's the quote, knowledge is simply perception. So Theaetetus has concluded that at 151E. At 152A, Socrates states, but look here, this is no ordinary account of knowledge you've come out with. It's what Protagoras used to maintain. And Protagoras continues throughout this dialogue as a key kind of character that's referenced in the background. So he says it's what Protagoras used to maintain. He said that he said the very same thing, only he put it in a rather different way, where he says, that man is the measure of all things, of the things which are that they are, and of the things which are not that they are not. So Protagoras said, it's our perception. If we see that something is, well, then it is. If we have seen that it is not, then it is not. And there's no dispute over that. So man is a measure of all things. Man understands the limit of what is and what is not. And we're always able to distinguish between what is and what is not. So that's really the fundamental part that I think we need to drive at maybe in this first session is man the measure of all things? So if I see something or smell something or hear or taste or touch something, is my perception of that absolute and correct? So here at 154A to 154B, if Joel, if you wouldn't mind taking the lead on this as Socrates and JK as Theaetetus.
James, can you mention which Joel? We are having a little bit of a chat debate here.
Oh, sorry, it was Joel S. that I was volunteering for this one.
Am I Joel? Am I who you're referring to? Is it Joe or Joel?
It was you actually.
Oh,
Joel.
okay, fine.
Joel, yeah.
Fine.
Okay.
I just wasn't clear. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll 154A to B.
Yeah.
And I'll be Socrates.
Yeah.
Let us follow what we stated a moment ago and posit that there is nothing which is in itself one thing. According to this theory, black or white or any other color will turn out to have come into being through the impact of the eye upon the appropriate motion. And what we naturally...
Isn't this the wrong dialogue?
Am I in the wrong place?
I thought we were doing 152.
Oh, no, sorry. No, this is the part that I wanted to do here. I read a section of 152 earlier, so I just thought that we would look at this part. We can go back to 152 later, but I just thought that we would look at this part now.
No, me bad. Thanks.
No worries.
Sorry, shall I just start again?
If you wouldn't mind, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Let us follow what we stated a moment ago and posit that there is nothing which is in itself one thing. According to this theory, black or white or any other color will turn out to have come into being through the impact of the eye upon the appropriate motion. And what we naturally call a particular color is neither that which impinges nor which is impinged upon, but something which has come into being between the two, and which is private to the individual percipient. Or would you be prepared to insist that every color appears to a dog or any other animal the same as it appears to you?
No, I most certainly shouldn't.
Well, and do you even feel sure that anything appears to another human being like it appears to you? Wouldn't you be much more disposed to hold that it doesn't appear the same, even to yourself, because you never remain like yourself?
Yes, that seems to me nearer the truth than the other.
Well, now, supposing such things as size or warmth or whiteness really belong to the object we measure ourselves against or touch, it would never be found that this object had become different simply by coming into contact with another thing and without any change in itself. On the other hand, if you suppose them to belong to what is measuring or touching, then this again could never become different simply because something else had come into its neighborhood or because something had happened to the first thing, nothing having happened to itself. As it is, you see, we may easily find ourselves forced into saying the most astonishing and ridiculous things, as Protagoras would point out, or anyone who undertook to expound the same views.
Well, thank you both for that. I think that's so this is picking up again on the idea that is man the measure of all things? And, I think there's a few interesting themes in here maybe that we could talk about. The idea that, at the end of the first paragraph there, would you be prepared to insist that every color appears to a dog or to any animal the same as it appears to you? That's the question. And Theaetetus concluded no. And then there's an interesting question. Wouldn't you be much more disposed to hold that it doesn't appear the same even to yourself because you never remain like yourself? And I'm just wondering what people think about that. And here I'm thinking back to the discussion that we had on the Charmides, that dialogue that was really all about the science of self. Is the self something that maintains, some sort of constant fixed proportions in itself? And so I'm just wondering what people think about this. The other interesting thing about this is the line that what we naturally call a particular color is neither that which impinges nor which is impinged upon, but something which has come into being between the two. So we have the word being in there, which we've discussed a number of times before, and the idea of in between. So it's partaking neither of the one or the other. And so, JK, what are your thoughts about this section or any of these questions?
I just want to comment about the idea of the self, and he's questioning the idea of identity, and that if everything is in flux, and even the idea of the self is also in flux and changing, so you really don't have a fixed identity. We just think that we do, because we have a name that we attach ourselves to, and we have certain, relationships with other people and the environment that we get recognition from others that we are who we think we are based on what they tell us, and confirm that we think we are. But that idea of identity is in flux, that we share this common sense idea of what we are, and this and these are good ideas of who we are, and it helps us, in our relationships with other people. But to believe that that's who you are, and that's a fixed notion of who you are, he's bringing that into question, and that.
Indeed, and I think Donald raised the idea earlier of identity and how we maintain some connection with our identity, and I think that's an important point. And then, would we want our identity to be fixed all the time in any event? Would it be a positive for us, or would it be a problem for us if our identity were fixed? Is that something that we want the ability to have some agency over, or the ability to change? Do we want our identity to be subject to some sort of flux? And if it's subject to a flux, do we want it to be subject to our own flux, or to a flux that something else has imposed on it? So thank you for raising that question. Moshe, your ideas?
This is absolutely fantastic. Okay. Does it appear the same even to yourself because you never remain yourself? And the second paragraph of Socrates, that a thing is, white or warm, whatever it is, because we measure ourselves against touch we measure ourselves against or by touch, or it's in its neighborhood. Socrates concludes that it has nothing to do, having nothing happen to itself, having nothing to do with the thing in itself. Okay, so this to me is a private, what's called nowadays a private language argument, because we're saying that we can't tell if the same is warm or a certain color because we don't have a private color chart that we can compare with our current perception. We don't have a private shape chart that we can compare to our perception. We don't have a common thermometer with objective gradations on it that we identify as warm, hot, neutral, cold. We don't have a private dictionary that we can use to say, oh, the word red is associated with this particular item on my private color chart, because I can't have a private color chart. So to me, this says, first of all, I love this, uninterestingly autobiographical, but it really anticipates, later analytical thinking on private languages, and at the same time, Kantian thinking, distinguishing between things as they appear and things as they are in themselves, which in Kant's terms we may not be able to conceive, but it is still, it is still something there accessible by reason. So I just want to share my excitement about that. Thank you for highlighting this particular passage.
Well, and thank you for introducing me, Moshe, to the idea of private languages. I hadn't heard of that before, but I think that's, I'm seeing a lot of relevance of that idea, and especially the way that you put it in terms of, objectivity versus subjectivity. Is there an objective definition of any particular color? Or, for example, I found the use of color particularly interesting in this because thinking back to what Socrates says in the Meno, color is the effluvium of shape. And then he says shape is the limit of a solid. So color is kind of this derivative of different things. And color appears in different gradations maybe to each of us. And so each of us has a different way of perceiving color. And, it's presumably at this time that Plato was writing this, the whole kind of prismatic differentiation of color, the things the kind of things that Newton observed, in the late 1600s, for example, hadn't existed, but yet he's bringing this very sophisticated idea of color is coming between two things. There's a connection here to the geometry that I want to pick up on, but we'll take Donald and JK first. Donald?
Got to stop raising my hand.
No worries.
But now that we've got out Protagoras is the statement that man is the measure of all things, I think we have to observe that Theaetetus and Theodorus are measurers also, not of all things, but of mathematical and geometric things. In fact, that's what Theaetetus is famous for here, or at least brings out his ability to measure things that previously had been, what's the term they use? Incommensurable. Things that cannot be measured. It's almost, I feel almost sometimes like there's almost a little joke here. Protagoras, you say man is the measure of all things. Well, here's a unit and here's a surd. Please measure both of them for me. Show me that how man is the measure of all things.
Thank you, and that was the perfect segue into the geometry that I can talk about in a few minutes. But you picked up, I think, on the irony in 163a, which I've kind of highlighted in the footnote on the first page of the document on the shared drive. And in this passage, Socrates is putting words in the mouth of Protagoras. He says, "You just rely on plausibility. Though if Theodorus or any other geometer were to do that in his branch of science, it's a good-for-nothing geometer he would be. And so Protagoras pretends to know that it's actually on the first page of that, Eva, the one with the spiral of Theodorus on it, and the quote right at the top. This idea that Protagoras can pretend to know whether Theodorus is a good for nothing geometer or not. So there's some particular irony in that Plato is playing upon. So I think you raised that important point, and maybe we can just leave this diagram on the screen and maybe just give a little thought to what Plato's trying to say with geometry here a number of times. But we'll go to JK first.
Yeah, I want to just touch on the idea of what Feynman mentioned, that language, use of language to name things, maybe it's not that as important as knowing the thing, but if you wanted to share, what you know with other people, then you need this kind of a public language. And so it's not discounting the idea that there's no private language that you can come up with for yourself. But if you want to communicate with other people, then you need to enter into this shared public space where there is this language that everybody understands, and you want them to understand you. So I want to touch on this notion of private language.
That's actually a really interesting connection that you made, I think, to what Moshe said about private languages and this idea of the public language being a shared language. That's a really interesting. So we've got a private language and a shared language, and certainly, understanding what each other is saying is a key theme to the Phaedrus, which we discussed. And I think that's a really interesting use of that. So thank you for making that connection, and especially for tying it to what Feynman said in that introductory video that we looked at. Moshe, what do you think about that?
Well, I just want to clarify my point. That my point was that a private language is impossible because we can't have things like a private color chart. We can't have things like a private dictionary because there's nothing to keep them the same. There's a color chart that an artist has all these different colors that goes around it, all different sorts of reds, blues, greens, things like that. You can't have that by memory. Memory doesn't support that kind of thing. It's not as if we could take it out and share it with a bunch of people and everyone could say, oh, that's a blue and that's a red, that's a green. Our notions of sizes, we don't have a chart that shows us privately what we mean by the word size. So all language has to be public, and private language is impossible. So if you think that there's some sort of private language that you're relating to a public language, I'm saying that's impossible because the private language itself is.
Sorry, we had an algorithmic interruption there. Sorry. So thank you, Moshe, for that clarification. I think, and I wonder what people think about that. When you said private language, I guess maybe I was assuming that it's kind of what my inner voice is telling me. But maybe I misunderstood the concept of private language in that context. It was just an assumption that I immediately made in my head. This idea of whether there is in fact a private language is an interesting question that you raised. JK, your ideas?
Yeah, I think that's probably an interesting topic because that's exactly what that school of thought, or Wittgenstein, right, asserts that there is no private. You can't have a private language. But there are a lot of you mentioned artists, that do have a private language in which they could it becomes shared maybe at a later date when people catch up to what he was doing, right? So it is possible that a certain scientist, certain scientists that make discoveries that nobody else. He's way ahead of others' understanding. So it's private when only he can understand it, right? And it becomes public later when other people catch on to that and is able to understand it. So just like what's the guy, the scientist Bruno was, burned at the burned by the church, because they didn't want him to assert those things, and they probably didn't understand what he was doing, but it was a threat, and maybe nobody else at that time really understood what he was doing, and only later when it became more public and understood, then they recognized, well, this, then it becomes public. So yeah, I think there is that's just raises the interesting question about whether there is such a thing as a private language.
Interesting and interesting use of the analogy to artists, especially in that quote at 152b to 153a. The part that I read earlier about Homer, for when Homer talked about ocean, begetter of gods, and Tethys, their mother, he made all things the offspring of flux and motion, or don't you think he meant that? And maybe this is the idea of, are these Homer's own ideas or are these shared ideas? So maybe I don't know about the terminology of private language, and maybe Moshe can talk more about this, but at least this artistic representation is something that is individual to the artist. Does that artistic expression have an effect on us as the observers of the art? I think observation is certainly a key thing, and that'll be in our next reading in the next section that I was thinking we could turn to. But does the artistic impression that is made on us by others affect our sense of things? And certainly when in 152d to 153a, when Socrates says, so here he's talking about Homer making flux the begetter of all things. He says, and if anyone proceeded to dispute the field with an army like that, an army led by Homer, he could hardly help making a fool of himself, could he? And I really like that. It's that paragraph right there, sort of about 2/3 of the way down there, and it's really. I thought that was an interesting kind of thing. Like who could dare to debate with Homer? Homer, the often quoted, and so that was an interesting take on that. Greg, what are your thoughts?
I was sitting here listening. I think the issue perhaps is more semantic than real. Here is like what J.K. and Marshall meant. Really, I think one is meant to be private understanding, and I think the language itself is public. Because language has to be public. It's a tool. Everybody have to use the same tool, just describe and think about the same things. But the understanding can be different. So you have private understanding, but a public language. That's what my comment is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think that's maybe a helpful clarification. This idea that each of us has a different understanding, and understanding, maybe how is understanding formed? Is it based on meaning, perhaps? And this is something that I think we talked about in Phaedrus as well. The use of language, and when we translate language, it's translated based on meaning. I think that was the conclusion that a number of the participants reached at the point. And so maybe understanding is key here. Moshe, your thoughts?
I want to address this thing about art. I was reading Walter Benjamin, who was in the 1930s. He was a critic. He was a literary critic, but it applied to all sorts of things. And what he was saying was that criticism is vital to the creation of art. It is much a part of something being an art as it is the producer of the so-called art itself. If you take a look at music, if you take a look at Beethoven, you can, or any other person you want, the meaning and significance of Beethoven changes during the periods, the historical periods that the observer is in, based upon the criticism that we bring to the art relevant to our social cultural milieu. And as far as an artist having an internal language, I think that if Benjamin is right, and Walter Benjamin is right, and criticism is actually part of the artistic process, we could understand a so-called artist, throwing bottles of paint all over himself and then going and rolling around on a canvas, and that being judged as art somehow in the criticism. Maybe when the person looks at it reflectively is saying, that's great art. Other people at the time would say, well, that's junk. And then 100 years later, after Pollock, whatever Pollock's first name was, came out and was regarded as a great artist because he was dribbling paint all over the place, we could say, well, that guy with the wet T-shirt, he really anticipated Pollock. I mean, what great stuff that he was doing. But it has nothing to do, it has as much to do with the artist as it does with the criticism of the artist. So the artist doesn't have to have any internal dialogue or internal language or internal meeting in order to be able to put this stuff out in a public forum and later have it become art as a result of criticism.
A really interesting perspective. Thank you. Certainly, I think the criticism of the art is kind of almost intrinsic to the process, isn't it? So, very interesting point. Thank you, Eva. If you could maybe just put on that first page again, the one with the spiral. I just wanted to explore just a little bit about why. What is the account of the reasons why Plato brought geometry into this, and in particular, the spiral of Theodorus. So this is referenced at, he references the spiral of Theodorus at 147e. And here Theodorus talks about how he generated the spiral. And so Plato refers to geometry a number of times in this dialogue. At the beginning, he says geometry is a branch of philosophy. I don't think we think of geometry as such these days, but certainly Plato refers to it as such at that point. And I just wanted to see if we could maybe just kind of understand the context in which Plato was writing and the context in which he's bringing this in. And is there something that he would like us to think about here or to consider here? There's a passage as well at 148a, which gets actually a little bit technical in some of the geometry. 147e and D and E and 148a. 148a in particular, Theaetetus says, when we took the intermediate numbers, such as 3 and 5, and any number which can't be produced by multiplication of 2 equals, but only by multiplying together a greater and a less, a number such that it is always contained by a greater and a less side. A number of this kind we compared to an oblong figure and called it an oblong number. I'm wondering if this is somehow related to this idea of an intermediate form in that passage that we just, in that passage that Joel and JK read a little bit earlier. And is there a particular importance of this particular spiral? And why does Plato bring this into the dialogue? I guess, Plato was a dramatist. I was told before he wrote these dialogues. And is there a particular dramatic element? Because I think maybe what Moshe said about criticism, it's the understanding of the artist. I think maybe that's important. And so the artist of this dialogue is Plato. And what do we understand of his background when we apply our own critical perspective on it? And maybe that's kind of important to understand. Donald, your thoughts?
Well, I think I didn't see where you were going, but I think the point I wanted to make was about appearances. That what Protagoras extracts from appearances, I guess, man is, judges, measures. But if we think about geometry, and the Theodorus in here was doing this from diagrams. And like in the Meno, that maybe these were with on a sand table or something. They weren't probably using paper to draw on. These diagrams are appearances. And I don't know what Protagoras would extract from these appearances, but what the geometers extract from these appearances, from drawings like this, where in actual fact, none of these are geometric lines or triangles or whatever. They're poor representations, and you can't tell that things are incommensurable by somehow measuring the lines in the diagram. What they see in this diagram, what they measure from this diagram, is something eternal, something unchanging. It's like they see the infinite in the finite or something. They have a different relationship. They're not philosophers, but I think Plato, Socrates, sees here a model for how philosophy could work at a different level, and see something very profound in appearances. Things appear, but what do we get from them? As man, how do we measure them? And Theodorus and Theaetetus see a lot here, a lot that most of us wouldn't see.
Thank you. I think, Donald, you were the one who mentioned earlier that Theaetetus and Theodorus are the measurers, those who measure, and the measurers are different from that which is measured. So the measurers are the observers, and that which is measured is the thing, maybe. And so there's an interesting, idea at 152D where Socrates says, I'll tell you now, or I'll tell you, and this now is certainly no ordinary theory. I mean, the theory that there is nothing which in itself is just one thing. So there's two interesting words that I picked up in that, the word one and the word thing. And what do we understand by the meaning of the word one and the word thing? And here in this spiral, which is based on Pythagorean, the basic Pythagorean theorem, which I think, almost all of us maybe learned at one point. I don't remember when I learned it in school. It's that little bit of knowledge that just always seems to have been there. A squared plus B squared equals C squared in a right angled triangle. So a triangle where there's a 90-degree angle, as we see here in this spiral, the little square notches in the first three triangles, the one with the square root of 1, the square root of 2, and the square root of 3 has that little square angle. So that's a 90-degree angle. And so Theodorus was able to construct this right angled triangle in a way that it moved around in a circular fashion, but the circle is never completed. And we have in here incommensurable lengths, like the square root of 3 is incommensurable. The square root of 5 is incommensurable. And yet 1 itself is not incommensurable. So we have a mix of that which is commensurable and that which is incommensurable. And so when you said, Donald, that maybe this is a model for how philosophy can be, or a model that could apply to philosophy, I'm actually kind of seeing some meaning in what you said there, and I'm just wondering what others think, either in this kind of construction, or what was the meaning that Plato was trying to imply with this? Plato being the dramatist who is presenting this dialogue to us. So it's a very interesting thought here. This idea that we get these. The one constant in this spiral is the 1 on the outer edge. All the time it's 1. That's the fixed thing. What's not fixed are the internal lengths. The only internal length that's really fixed are the commensurable internal lengths. For example, the square root of 1, square root of 4, is 2. So anyway, what are your thoughts, JK?
Yeah. Related to philosophy, is he saying that everything else is in flux, but somehow, mathematics, is something that may not be, that somehow there's something this is something beyond all the changes and the flux of life experience.
Mm.
But somehow, these geometric forms, measurements, and so forth have stayed the same in terms of the formulas of measurement. Is that what he's getting at?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, math is maybe something that is knowable in terms of, there being equations, and one thing equals another. We know that E equals MC squared. That equal sign tells us that there's that fixed relationship. And so maybe that's something that we can know. But then Donald used the word measurer. So how do you measure? Do you use math to measure? Or do we use some other method to measure? So measure, how do you know the length of something? So when Protagoras says that man is the measure of all things, what is it that establishes the measure? And maybe there's something in this geometry. Maybe it's the connections, the vertices in this spiral that are actually establishing the measure of each length, right? So the individual lines could go on forever. But what is it that delineates a line? What is it that establishes the beginning of a line and the end of a line? So is the measurement, or is the measure something different from the math? And I think it maybe has something fundamental to do with this idea of this notion of Protagoras, that man is the measure of all things. JK?
Yeah, if Protagoras is saying that man is the measure of all things, somehow he's suggesting that man determines by its own perceptions and understandings, how the world is, that we actually create the world within, with our own minds. But when it comes to something like mathematics, some people do believe that we created the mathematics and determines the reality of the world we live in. But is mathematics created by us, or is it discovered? Right? So that's the question. If it's discovered, then there's something else beyond man's measure of all things. It's not how we, it's not up to us to determine how it is. It has its own determination.
Really made me think, JK. I appreciate that, actually, this idea of, if math pre-exists our own knowledge, and, again, to go back to what Plato said in the Meno, all knowledge being recollection, then how are we to be the ones that establish that measure of that knowledge? So that's a very interesting point. If we are recollecting math, we're not actually inventing math, we're recollecting it. It's a very interesting point. I would draw I didn't put this in the readings in the shared drive, but there's a little passage at 148D to E, in which Socrates again makes a reference to geometry. So at the beginning, he said that geometry is a branch of philosophy. And at 148D to E, Socrates says, go on then, you gave us a good lead just now. Try to imitate your answer about the powers. So that the spiral of Theodorus is all about the powers, the squares, the powers. says, try to imitate your answer about the powers. Then you brought together the many powers within a single form. Now I want you in the same way to give one single account of the many branches of knowledge. So again, I asked a few moments earlier, do we know what the definition of one is? Do we all share the same definition of one? And then in this particular passage, he's talking about bringing all the powers together within a single form. Earlier, he said that the number of powers are unlimited, which would be another way of saying infinite. So there's infinite powers, which is actually the title of the Steve Strogatz book that I mentioned at the beginning when I mentioned his podcast, Infinite Powers. So there's infinite powers, and yet Socrates says here, you brought together the many powers within a single form. So this idea of the forms, maybe I'm wondering, is it taking shape maybe in this spiral that he's presenting here? So food for thought. I don't know, but I'm wondering if the way we define thing and the way we define one may have some relevance to this. And again, that idea of definition, and do we share a common definition of these things? Donald and then Greg.
One, I think there is something different about, if you look at this diagram, Pythagoras says, well, it could mean different things to different people. And in one sense, it may. That is, there will be some people that won't understand it, but there'll be others that look at this diagram and say, well, however imperfect a representation this is of the roots and powers, this is telling me something. It's providing some invariant, something that's not changing, something that's true. And I would say mathematically, in this stuff, it makes no difference what the length of one is. It can be any arbitrary length. But this diagram shows how to construct a series of other lengths, beginning with any value for one, any actual length for one, some of which will be lengths and some of which will be surds, as Theaetetus says. And he points out how to pick out, 4, 9, 16, and say those are the links and the others are surds. So, I think in a sense, yes, I don't know if this is the forms, if mathematics are forms, but they certainly, in some ways, seem to be an extraction of invariance from appearances which are not invariant, they're flux, or they're constantly changing.
Interesting thought. Thank you. And this, the idea that one is maybe undefined, is just simply one unit. I just actually, Joel, who's a co-host here, Joel G, if I know I saw you had a question, so if you'd like to ask your question.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh man, that was fast.
Yeah, sorry, I just saw it. Yeah.
Yeah, a very, very quick question related back to what you and I was talking about a few days or a week ago about that video about Spinoza and Leibniz, about this question of whether on mathematics, so to speak, is this in any way related to all on the questions of essence versus substances, excuse me? Is that relevant in any way, whether it's physical or metaphysical in some sense, or is that too out in left field?
I think you hit an important point, and I think it maybe relates to what Donald just said in terms of the incommensurable. So maybe if the incommensurable elements in this diagram are maybe if we equate those with kind of the metaphysical, that which never ends versus the physical, which has an ending and a beginning, maybe there is a relationship there that's that we can think about, or an analogy that we can think about there. So it's a good question, I think. Thank you. Greg?
Yes, I just have some thoughts about the point that you want to discuss about the Pythagoras saying that man is the measure of all things. And I think from my understanding, reading Plato's and all the discussion here, it seems that the man here is pointed to specific person, like particulars, you and me, Joe, anybody, that everybody sees things differently. And in that context, that a lot of discussions are laid out. But there is also, I think, I haven't seen yet in the discussion, but if we stand today's position, stand where we are now, I think this man I refer to as a species. The species of man is a measure of all things. And I think there is some truth in it. It's like all knowledge we gain today, mathematics, physics, or science, or other branches, at the end of the day, is look to develop from the prism of man as a species, not from horse, from dog, or any other things. So in that kind of context, I found that sentence has a profound inner meaning, in the sense that the relation between man's conscience and the order in the universe. Anyway, that's my comment.
An interesting point that you make about the generality of the species versus the particularity of the individual man. So I think that's an interesting point. And certainly there was a passage in the dialogue, and I didn't mark it, but where I think Socrates asks, well, I think he used a baboon, for example, is if a baboon perceives something or a different animal perceives something, does that constitute knowledge? And then, once we go beyond knowledge, there's also the question in this dialogue, which I don't think we'll have a chance to explore maybe this session, but I'd maybe like to pick up on it next section, is the idea of the connection between wisdom and knowledge. And I think maybe you just use the word order. And I'd like us maybe to think about the question of how order fits into a distinction between wisdom and knowledge. So it's one thing to have knowledge of particular facts, but then in what order do we put that knowledge? And does order have an effect on what we consider wisdom? So the idea of wisdom is raised in this first part, but it's not really explored fully. So that's just, I think you mentioned the word order, and I just wanted to mention that as something that we can maybe come back to next time. So thank you. And I'll take Jerry now. Jerry, welcome. And what are your thoughts?
Hi, thank you. Well, I'm going to say stuff that's going to probably be obvious and what people already have said, but I find when I try to put it into my words, it helps me understand things. So let me know if I'm saying this correctly. So what it seemed to me is that whole point of lines 142 and 143 was that Socrates had asked Theaetetus for a definition of knowledge. And Theaetetus gave him a whole bunch of examples of knowledge. And Socrates said, no, that's not what I want. I want something similar to what Theodorus does when he teaches geometry. Well, what is that? So then we get into this discussion of Theodorus, tracing all these powers, and the numbers of powers are infinite, but they're classifiable. Some of them are squares and some of them are roots. Some are commensurable, some are incommensurable. And Theodorus is able to tell you what makes something incommensurable, versus what makes something commensurable. So then it seems like Socrates is looking for that kind of an explanation to knowledge, the ability to take an infinite number of things and to classify them and explain why something belongs into one class versus another class. So why we classify a certain object as knowledge and maybe another object as opinion? it seems like he's looking for something that allows us to make distinctions and classify things. How that gets us to the forms, I'm not exactly sure, but that's what I understand the point of that section to be.
Thank you. And certainly the idea of actually speaking these things, I think one does make connections in the mind that maybe unspoken, those connections don't exist. And so this is something that I do myself, I think, and you raise a good point with that. And the word classification that you used, just kind of triggers some thoughts in my own mind about, again, how do we go from the particulars? How do we go inductively, maybe from there to the general form that we're really trying to find, and do we use common classifications in a way that others can understand? So I think you put that well, and it was I found it helpful for my own thinking. So I appreciate that. Moshe, and then JK.
I want to look at two things. One, incommensurables are not the same as irrationals. When we say that something is incommensurable, we mean that we can't form a ratio. We can't describe something as a Pythagorean ratio between two numbers. And this was particularly important in Pythagoras, who thought that everything could be expressed as a ratio. But a triangle with a base of 1 and a side of 1 has its, the diagonal is equal to the square root of 2, which is irrational, but it's also, it can't be, you can't measure the two sides with the same measure that you do the angle. Okay? So I just want to make that distinction between irrationals and incommensurables. I don't know if anyone can prove that the set of all irrationals is the same as the set of all incommensurables. It'd be an interesting mathematical question. The other thing that I want to go back to is this original Pythagorean theorem. Oh, can you hear me? Because I have kids down below that are screaming.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Because on your example...
We're having a little hard time hearing you, actually, because of that background noise.
Okay, just a second. Okay. At 152, he says, well, you have delivered yourself of a very important doctrine about knowledge. It is indeed the opinion of Protagoras, who has another way of expressing it. And this, I take it as, it's not a quote, but it is Socrates appears to be making a quote. Man, he says, is the measure of all things, of the existence of things that are, and of the non-existence of things that are not. So this sounds almost Parmenidean, that he's equating, Parmenides says the only things that exist are the things that are intelligible, that don't require a contradiction, and everything else doesn't exist. This is a very existential statement. He's talking about being when he's saying that man is the measure of being itself, whether something exists or whether something doesn't exist. And this is very strange because all the examples that we usually give about Protagoras, and it even comes up in this too, about, two people go into a room and one person says it's hot and the other person says it's cold. And, you put your hand in a body of water, and to one person it feels warm and to another person it feels cold. These are all the, kinds of perceptual things that we usually attribute to Protagoras. And now to say that being itself is something that is the measure of man takes that, in my mind, to another higher level. Okay. So that being said, I'm wondering if the general criticism of Protagoras, which I will give in a second, holds for being as well as it does for the other qualitative arguments that Protagoras seems to destroy by talking about man being the measure of all things. And that is the general notion that predicate relativism, in other words, if we're going to say that any predicate that we give a particular object is relative to me or to you or to somebody else, or if being itself is something that is relative to you or me and everybody else. Predicate relativism requires subject absolutism. In other words, we have to be talking about the same water that can be both hot and cold. We have to be talking about the same being, whatever that is, whether it exists or it's not. So Pythagoreanism requires a type of subject absolutism which seems to be inescapable. What do you think about that?
It was a really interesting way of putting that, Moshe, and we're just, unfortunately, we just have a few minutes left here, but what you spoke about, I think, really speaks to the third reading at 160A to 160B, which we won't get a chance to get to today. And it's this idea between this is the idea that the observer is passive and is observing an action, so that the observer is in a different passive realm from the action itself. And this idea that the subject absolutism, there has to be agreement on that. That's a really interesting, fascinating idea that I think has particular consequences to, and I mentioned it before, the world of quantum computing that we're about to enter into. And I should just explain the background on my screen here is it's not a qubit. I was looking for an image of a qubit that I could put on the screen. This is the closest that I could come to it. This is an image I had before of a tetrahedron inside a sphere. But there is no absolutism. If this tetrahedron is spinning around, there's no necessarily particular absolutes about this. And so I like how you put that, the subject absolutism and the predicate being the relativity, because certainly in that reading at 168 at 160B, which those who want can do it on their own, does talk about that, and particularly in the context of becoming. So you mentioned the idea of being. And when I think of Timaeus 128a, this idea that being is eternal, and one can only understand being by making an account, or by making a reasoned account. That's what Plato says at 128 or 28a of Timaeus. Meanwhile, we exist in the realm of becoming. And so I think that distinction that you drew there is interesting. And certainly when in 160b, Socrates says, you must always use the words for somebody or of something or relatively to something. This is in terms of the observer and that which is observed. So that idea of relativity, I think, is an important one that you raise. So thank you for that. We have, unfortunately, I think, reached the kind of end. There's so many ideas. This is such an intriguing and in many, it's a dialogue on many different levels, a dialogue of many different dimensions, I think. And as I said at the beginning, every time I read it, I find something new in it. So I'm really looking forward to reviewing the recording of this, because there have been so many good ideas brought up here, and I didn't have a chance to write them all down. So I think that's a bit of the memory project that I will undertake after this ends and after we end the recording. Again, to pick up on this theme of memory, that last reading, which again we won't get to either, but the idea that memory is really a part of knowledge. So there's perception, but there's also memory, and we can have knowledge by way of memory as well as by way of perception. So that was the agreement that Theaetetus and Socrates reached at 164b, that memory is a part of knowledge. And certainly there will be a memory of this episode in the podcast recording that will be posted in the coming weeks. So invite anybody to listen to that who wants to. And we look forward to reconvening in 2 weeks, where we'll look at the next part of the Theaetetus, and I'll kind of set a dividing line for that section, probably another 24 or so pages. And I don't think we'll reach the end of the Theaetetus this season, but I think it will set us up well for the next season. So anyway, I'll invite Eva to kind of wrap up the recording momentarily, and just to remind those who would like to stay on for Plato's Cafe for a half an hour after we finish the recording, you're more than welcome to. And so with that, I will pass it over to Eva with thanks to everybody.
Thank you, friends. Thank you, James, for putting all this together. We are looking forward to see you for the next episode in 2 weeks. It is always exciting to brainstorm with Plato's ideas and all participants' ideas here. We appreciate all perspectives. This was it for today. Until next time. Bye.